I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today we discuss the latest from the battlefields of Ukraine and Russia, take a brief look at the implications of the death of Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi, and talk to Colin Freeman about his recent reporting tour in the Donbas.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 20th of May, 2 years and 87 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant and foreign reporter Colin Freeman. I started with the latest news from Ukraine. So, the Ukrainian General Staff have said Russian forces conducted an unsuccessful mechanised assault on Friday. Going to start over the weekend, start back on Friday. This was a roughly reinforced company size. A bit more detail came from the ISW, Institute for the Study of War. They say 2 tanks and 21 infantry fighting vehicles were used in the attack on the eastern side of Chasiv Yar. Now, that is quite a sizable chunk of material, and perhaps the push that one would expect whilst you are trying to keep your enemy focused elsewhere on potentially a diversionary attack. So what I'm talking about is, if this effort in the vicinity of Kharkiv that for the last week or 10 days or so, which we'll speak about in a moment, if that was a diversion that has been suggested, it would be designed to draw in Ukrainian reserves, and we should expect to see a bigger push elsewhere. Now, nothing happened for a few days, which is not unexpected. You want to draw the enemy in. But what's happened now is that the Kharkiv assault isn't really going anywhere, but hasn't drawn in much Ukrainian reserve. We think elements of 3 brigades have been moved there, so it's not caused a huge amount of conniptions in the Ukrainian forces. Plus, Russia has not been able to take advantage of that in the area of what is assessed, still continues to be assessed as their main efforts around Chasiv Yar. Now, remember, there was a thought that Russia wanted to take Chasiv Yar by Victory Day parade, May the 9th. Of course, you don't want your enemy to be advancing at all, but for all the bluster about Kharkiv being terminal, Russia having strategic momentum, Ukraine being starved of ammo, there's not an awful lot happening in terms of the lines moving, which says a lot about the capability of the Russian army right now. So if this push, whatever it was on Friday, into Chasiv Yar, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that didn't work, if that was the main assault, with Kharkiv being a diversion, it's not worked. Now, it might still be very early days, and we don't know, but that's how I look at things as it pans out on the battlefield. Anyway, back to the updates. Overnight, Saturday, Sunday, Ukrainian drone strikes hit Russian military infrastructure and oil refineries in Crimea, and then in Krasnodar Krai and Leningrad Oblasts in Russia. It's estimated Ukrainian strikes on Russia's refining infrastructure has resulted in a 14% reduction in capacity. That's not massive, but is certainly not insignificant. Now, the ISW say that, or note, Russian MOD said that their forces destroyed 9 ATACMS missiles over Crimea near Sevastopol and Belbek airfield just to the north. Of course, we should pause for a moment, decide whether or not we're going to believe the numbers Moscow are putting out, but we should note that something seems to have hit a vessel, naval vessel in Sevastopol port. So in this overnight Saturday-Sunday attack, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry said that its forces sank a minesweeper, the Kovrovets minesweeper, in the strike, about 150 miles south of the line. Russian telegram channels confirmed a loss, leaping on the opportunity for a bit of mischief. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry said on Twitter, another bad day for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. However, then Russian channels and other sources that I've been looking at are now reporting that the vessel hit was the much more modern caliber armed corvette Cyclone. 6 Russian sailors killed, 11 injured, we are told. This ship, built only last summer, was a carrier and launcher for the very fastest Zircon missiles, as well as other caliber and other cruise missiles. So you'll see footage published yesterday as well that also purportedly shows Russian forces attempting to repel Ukrainian drones over the port of Novorossiysk in Russia. On social media, you'll see something flying quite low in daylight a lot of rounds being put down by Russian sailors, I presume, at a very low angle of elevation. So something is blown up, something explodes in the sky, but there's loads of cheers all over the place. But those rounds are going to go somewhere. I mean, someone in a tower block somewhere is going to get that. Now, all these cheers amongst the Russian sailors, the irony seems lost on them that they're in Novorossiysk and having to repel drones. Krasnodar Krai's governor, Benjamin Konjatev, said that the air defence had shot down 10 drones and the falling debris had caused fires. I've not been able to verify that at all, and only seen the one social media post. So what's going on here then in Crimea? Well, no, for months we'll remember that many people are saying that the long-range ATACMS would be able to shift things on the battlefield. Other people say, no, there's not one piece of equipment that would do that. I tend to agree with that there's no silver bullet here. However, ATACMS, if it is what's being used, hitting ships, airfields, logistic bases, air defence sites in Crimea, is having a real effect. Of course, war is a team sport, and I tip my hat, if it's possible to do that, to maritime drones. But ATACMS in particular is increasingly making Crimea untenable for Russian forces and making the juice for Russia of operating there not worth the squeeze of losing signature kit. I'll be interested in Roland and Colin's views on this. Of course, Putin doesn't want to give up Crimea, arguably the political centre of gravity of this war. Without it, it would make the war very, very difficult. But Putin's increasingly being handed the choice of staying there and losing the exact stuff that he needs to prosecute the war elsewhere: air defence, Caliber cruise missile ships, a route into southern Ukraine. So does he reinforce Crimea, thereby switching resources from elsewhere, pull out, which is politically unacceptable? The fact Ukraine's now attacking the Black Sea Fleet in Novorossiysk just adds to the problem. And this, I see, might be a way for Ukraine to progress overall militarily, to somehow stay in the fight and not cede too much ground elsewhere, whilst also presenting so many problems to Russia, individually small, but collectively they all add up, that the system grinds to a halt. Now, again, a question for the lads in a minute. Do I think Putin's going to pull out of Crimea? No. But do I think the potential loss or the humiliation of staying there and losing signature kit might move him sooner to the negotiating table? Yes, I do. Anyway, a couple more updates from me. So yesterday, 12 people killed, 40 injured in Kharkiv Oblast. This comes from Governor Oleh Sybanov there. They said a Russian Iskander-M missile double-tap attack on the northern outskirts of Kharkiv reportedly killed 6 people, including a pregnant woman, and injured 28, including 2 medics. Now, last night, Ukrainian forces said they'd shot down all 29 Shahed drones launched by Russia at Odessa, Mykolaiv, Poltava, and Lviv oblasts. Russia reportedly launched these drones from the Primorsko Task, that's on the eastern side of the Sea of Azov, and Kursk Oblast in Russia. And that one borders the Sumy region up to the northeast. Sumy and Kherson also hit over the weekend. No reports of any deaths in those attacks. And then in a meeting with journalists, which I think happened on Friday or Saturday, attended by our friends at the Kyiv Independent, President Zelensky said Ukraine's partners, quote, are afraid of Russia losing the war. He said they would like Kyiv to win in such a way that Russia does not lose. He said Russia's loss would involve unpredictable geopolitics, and then went on to say, I don't think it works that way. For Ukraine to win, we need to be given everything with which one can win. And then finally, just up to date this morning, a Ukrainian rocket attack is said to have targeted a Russian military base a couple of kilometers just west of Luhansk city. You'll see images on social media, a very large explosion there. No further details known. And also this morning, Deputy Governor of Kharkiv Oblast, Roman Semenuka, speaking on national TV, said Ukrainian forces now control 60% of the town of Vovchansk, just north of Kharkiv, amid continued Russian assaults over the weekend. Just one for me on the diplomatic front. Worth noting, Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas said fears of sending troops to Ukraine to train the country's soldiers that could draw them into a war with Russia, she said, are, quote, not well-founded. Speaking to the Financial Times in an article that's out today, she said there are countries who are training soldiers on the ground already, although she didn't name names. She said it was not an automatic Article 5 moment if Russia attacked the training personnel, and said, I can't possibly imagine that if somebody is hurt there, then those who have sent their people will say, it's Article 5, let's bomb Russia. It's not how it works. It's not automatic. Which adds to this conversation at the moment about what would Western/NATO troops on the ground inside Ukraine training Ukrainian soldiers look like, kicked off by President Macron, backed up by some others, Britain's Foreign Secretary, for example, that idea. It's doing the rounds. It's out there as a conversation. We've mentioned it a few times. It's worth just noting it. I don't think there's going to be any immediate resolution, but we do need to note these comments from someone in the position of Estonia's Prime Minister. Now then, turning to our guest, Roland, really interested on your thoughts about any and everything that I've been mentioning there, Crimea and the comments from Kai Kallas. But as it's such a big story and it could frame the international context for a little while yet, could you just bring us up to date, please, with implications of the confirmed death of Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi and Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian? I note Charles Michel, the European Council President, tweeted this morning, the EU expresses its sincere condolences for the death of President Raisi and Foreign Minister Abdollahian, as well as other members of their delegation and crew in a helicopter accident. Our thoughts go to the families. To which very quickly, Hannah Newman, a member of the European Parliament, replied with, I want all the people in Iran to know that Charles Michel is speaking here as a private person, not as European Council President, and for sure not on behalf of Europeans. So it's all getting a little bit feisty in the response to this. But if you could bring us up to date, please, Roland, and give us a view on any possible future implications, please.
Yes, absolutely. So, as I'm sure everybody knows by now, Ebrahim Raisi, along with Iran's foreign minister and a couple of others, had been on a trip to Azerbaijan yesterday, where they had attended the opening of a dam with President Aliyev of Azerbaijan. It was a joint Iranian-Azerbaijani project. And on the flight home, they were flying in a convoy of 3 helicopters. They ran into extremely poor weather up in northwestern Iran, a very remote area. The helicopter the president was on went down. It took a long time we're told long time for the wreckage to be found. But yeah, by the time I woke up this morning, probably about 6 o'clock UK time, I turned on the world service and they were already saying, just confirming this breaking news, that he had been confirmed dead. So Ebrahim Raisi, who became president of Iran in 2021, now dead. The immediate implication of that is that the first vice president of Iran will take over for a caretaker period. There'll have to be a presidential election within 50 days. So we're looking at an election in Iran by early July, I suppose, 50 days-ish. There was meant to be the next one was going to be in 2025, so it's been brought forward a little bit. Now, in terms of implication, the thing to understand here, first of all, is that the president of Iran doesn't really set foreign policy. He doesn't really set the direction of domestic policy. Okay, the ultimate arbiter of power in Iran is the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and he remains very much in power. Anyone you talk to about Iran, it's one of the stories I've been reporting on and off for a few years, besides Ukraine and Russia and stuff. Anyone you talk to about Iran says that he's old, he's 85 this year, he's cogent, he's nobody's fool, he's very much in control and the whole system defers to him. So don't expect a shift in Iranian foreign policy, don't expect a shift in the confrontation in the Middle East with Israel, which is run by the IRGC anyway. I wouldn't expect a shift in Iran's kind of relationship with Russia and the delivery of drones for the Russian war effort. In fact, when we had the supreme leader on Twitter, within a few hours of the helicopter going down, putting out tweets addressed to the Iranian public, talking about how, look, don't worry, the state is going to keep on moving smoothly. There won't be any disruption, which I think suggests that they knew quite early on that the president was dead and they were trying to manage this news coming out. So I wouldn't see a big shift. But there's always a but. There's 2 big implications inside Iran, which may have implications further down the line. So the first one is Ebrahim Raisi was one of 2 men who were generally thought to be being groomed to potentially take over as supreme leader when Khamenei is off this mortal coil. And you can see from the way he behaves that he knows he's at the end of his life as well, that that's going to happen at some point. So who have you got left? You've got left his second son, who's a fairly shadowy, secretive figure, but we know that he's close to his father. He's meant to be close to the IRGC. He's considered quite an effective manager within the supreme leader's office, but he's not well known by the Iranian public. And this whiff, I wouldn't say a stench, but a whiff of hereditary monarchy there. And you've got to remember the Islamic Republic overthrew a monarchy. They're not meant to like kings or hereditary power. So you can imagine some disquiet, not just within the ranks of reformers and Iranian liberals, but amongst some hardliners about, hold on, are we really going to just install the son of the previous guy? Is that really what this place is all about? So I think you're going to see a power struggle within the hardliner factions inside Iran. Somebody's going to think, oh, there's an opening here now. Maybe I've got a chance. And then that further down the line, when Khamenei dies, who is that person who's going to take over? Is he going to be someone who's a firm believer, exactly the same kind of person, or will he guide Iran down a slightly different path? Who knows, but a big question. The other thing to remember is a very delicate time in Iran. It's really difficult to overstate how polarized things are there at the moment. Anyone you talk to will acknowledge it, that there is a hardcore of support for the regime, but there's also massive just fed upness, if I can turn that into a noun. People who feel like the economy's basically moribund. Sanctions don't help with that. There's massive widespread corruption, which is made worse by the fact that the regime has let the IRGC take over vast swathes of the economy, which means there's no transparency, which makes corruption worse. So everyone's very cynical about all that. And then there's the repression, the hijab law. You remember the massive protests over the last year or two following the death of a woman in custody at the hands of the so-called morality police. Right? Those were the biggest protests, the biggest challenge to the established power in Tehran since the Islamic Revolution that brought the Islamic Republic to power. All right? So this is a really, really delicate time in Iran. So although the death of Raisi is not going to shift the geopolitical balance that we look at on this podcast with a focus on Ukraine, not immediately, but it brings into focus these forces inside the country, these tensions that down the line really could change things. And you can see where Iran lies in this huge kind of geopolitical standoff. You have immediate words of condolence from Russia, from China, Iran very much on that side of things as the world divides into this global Mexican standoff. So those are my immediate thoughts on that, Dom.
Well, you said that the protests sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini a couple of years ago, I think it was a couple of years ago, probably got my dates wrong there, sorry, were the biggest since the start of the Islamic Republic. How significant is it, do you think, that there were fireworks over Tehran last night? I mean, a very obvious response to this death. You can't really say, well, it's just somebody's birthday. I mean, that was a very pointed demonstration to the authorities, or am I overplaying it?
I mean, I saw those pictures as well, and then I thought, oh, hold on. My responsible journalist head kicked in, and I was like, oh, are these pictures verified? I don't know. I haven't had time to go out and work out if that was definitely last night. But that's what I'm talking about, right? I mean, I was in Tehran for the election of the Raisi one that brought him to power in 2021. It was the lowest turnout of any presidential election in Iran since the Islamic Republic was established. It had the highest number of spoiled or uncounted ballots. It was a very distinctive way in which kind of liberal, reformist, non-hardline candidates were blocked from getting on the ballot in the first place. So there was this deep sense of cynicism and resignation, this sense amongst people who probably would have voted for a reformist candidate before that there's no point. This place can't be reformed. And just to share a little anecdote with you, I remember being at Raisi's victory rally, which I'm not sure he actually turned up to, which I thought was a bit of a snub to his supporters. Anyway, it's a big square in Tehran, lots of true believers, hardline voters, a lot of women actually there, waving their flags and speeches and all of this, and everybody trails off afterwards. And afterwards I was with Sam Tarling, the photographer we used to work with a lot in the Middle East, and he said, God, it's getting on in London now. Can we just sit here and I'll edit some photos on my laptop and send them? So fine, okay. So we're sitting there outside this metro station under an underpass or something in Tehran. He's on his laptop, I'm having a cigarette, it's getting dark, and these street sweepers clearing up the mess. And one of them's like, oh, are you a foreign journalist? Yeah, okay. And he just lets rip. I mean, just like everyone you saw standing there is an idiot. Raisi is a killer, all of this stuff. I tell that as an anecdote because it's striking, but it wasn't difficult during that time there to talk to people who felt really fed up. And they weren't afraid of talking about that, people who didn't want to vote for him. I mean, the 1988 things, he's a hanging judge. He was very involved in these, I suppose you call it a drumhead court-martial, and these little secret hearings and courts that sentenced thousands, the numbers are disputed, but thousands of political prisoners to death in 1988. People know about that, and people are angry with it. And I'm not saying that everybody in the Islamic Republic hates the Islamic Republic, but a lot of people do. And you can see how the fatigue crosses class lines now as well. To put it in the terms of the British culture war, North Tehran basically is the equivalent of North London. It's well off, it's leafy, it's where well-educated, liberal-leaning, rich people live, and you would expect Ebrahim Raisi or someone like that never to get a single vote from North Tehran, right? But anyone you talk to who follows Iran will tell you this crosses class boundaries. It doesn't mean that the regime is definitely on its last legs. It doesn't mean that they're completely without support. It doesn't mean they're not afraid to crack heads and spill blood to stay in power. But coming back to your original point, to see someone letting off fireworks over Tehran and at the same time to see some extra police on the street just in case something kicks off from the side of the authorities, that I think is quite a neat illustration of the kind of polarization that you hear talked about a lot when you talk to people about the dynamics in Iran at the moment. Sorry, long-winded answer, but that's the thought process I had when I saw those videos of fireworks, and also those videos of, oh, okay, so there's some more IRGC militia on the streets today. What's that all about?
Interesting. Right, we'll keep tabs on that, please. We'll come back to you over the next few days. Keep an eye on that. Now, the other thing I posited earlier on, and I'm going to get told off by David when he's back because I was mixing news with analysis, so look, let's just keep it amongst ourselves, please. But I was suggesting that what Ukraine are trying to do right now is just hang on the land, basically, and make Crimea so untenable for Russia that Putin really has to think about how much it's worth burning through his men and material to hang on to that chunk of land. What's your views on that? You've been there more often than anyone else, Roland, and also you've been to Novorossiysk. So talk to us a little bit about that town as well, please, because that's under attack.
Sorry, I want to refrain from making grand predictions about the intention. I mean, I think the attacks on Crimea, the air attacks, they're very noticeable. They're very obvious. My guess was it's the Ukrainians trying to stretch the Russians where they can. Right? If you can blow up Russian aircraft, if you can blow up Russian air defenses, if you can really threaten that, then you force them to deploy air defenses or something else there. It's one place where the Ukrainians are able to bring certain strength to bear and push the Russians in a way that the Russians are able to stretch the Ukrainians in all kinds of spaces as well. My only thought is that no matter how much you bomb it or fly ATACMS at it, the Ukrainians obviously are a very long way from ever threatening Russian possession of Crimea on land systematically. You remember before the counteroffensive last summer, there was some kind of armchair analysis of if they break through, if they make it to the Sea of Azov, then suddenly Crimea is in play, then like crisis for Putin. That didn't happen, and we're a long way from that. Novorossiysk is a little bit like a kind of low-lying fjord that makes a kind of natural harbour on the coast of, is it Krasnodar Krai? I went to Novorossiysk years ago when I was on the business desk of the Moscow Times, and the reason was there was a really murky corporate struggle for control of that port, and it's got an oil terminal and stuff that I could not get to the roots of it, but there were clearly a really classically Russian kind of tussle for control of that place commercially back then. We got a tour of the harbour. It was a large but fairly tired harbour. I did see a couple of Navy boats in the harbour at that point. The main thing then everyone was focused on was the oil terminal. That's why Novorossiysk was a big thing, and I do remember people talking about how it is an alternative for Sevastopol, but it's not as good. It's not as deep. Sevastopol is a better harbour, basically, was what I remembered from that.
Thank you. I do hope you weren't including me in this armchair general rant.
No, I was thinking of, who's that? There's a retired American general. There's a particular chap, is it Ben Hodges, who was talking a lot about how Ukraine is a centre of gravity, and there was lots of analysis like that. And you could see how it would work if that offensive had worked. And we know that the objective was the Sea of Azov. You know, you can see how that would be a crisis kind of thing. But I just think we're a long way from that now.
Yeah, I think we are. But I think if we are if at least entering the arena of Putin trying to decide at what point does he make serious suggestions about negotiations, albeit thinking, I'll buy for time now, come back in 10 years' time. He might decide, actually, now's about as good as it's going to get because he's just losing too much stuff. So he might play it. That's all I was saying, Roland. But never mind. Let's have a chat with Colin. Colin, you've just come back from your latest reporting trip to Ukraine. We spoke to you while you were out there. You've been speaking to draftees around the Chasiv Yar area. What were you chatting to those guys about? And any views on anything you've just heard there? And if you could be even more controversial than Roland, well, I'd be impressed.
Yeah, I did cover Iran several times when I was younger, but I haven't been there since about 2009, when the last big pro-democracy protests were snuffed out. So my knowledge is a bit out of date, really. I'll talk about something rather more current. Yeah, I was up in the Donbas until the end of last week. And as per usual, we were scouting around really for things to do and see around the front lines. The way we do this normally, just for listeners' benefit, is we approach different media officers and commanders that we know in different brigades fighting up and down the front lines and ask them what they can safely afford us to let us see and report on. So sometimes they say that we've got an artillery unit we can go and see. Sometimes they say you can come and observe a field hospital in action. Sometimes it will be to talk about infantry troops who recently participated in a particular battle. On this occasion, one unit that we have had dealings with said that they were training up some current conscripts who would be soon fighting in the Donbas. And we thought, well, that would be interesting because our readers hear a great deal about brave Ukrainians who are willingly going to the front lines. And that's a narrative that has been going on ever since the war, when volunteers who had never fought before were suddenly seen abandoning their jobs as software designers and picking up a Kalashnikov. But we thought this might strike a slightly different vibe, especially given the sense that the war is not going in Ukraine's way in the way that it used to. So we went off to a training ground and we observed conscripts from the 22nd Mechanized Brigade being trained, firing rocket-propelled grenades, shooting machine guns and so on. And certainly you very much a sense that these guys were being thrown in at the deep end. For a start, they are soon going to get deployed to somewhere like Chasiv Yar, which is the next town up that the Russians are trying to capture after their capture of Avdiivka back in February. So it's very, very intensive fighting, high casualty rates and so on. And these guys were being trained as frontline infantry troops. They weren't getting jobs as backroom clerks or anything else. So very much at the sharp end with the associated levels of casualties. And so we were asking one or two of them how they felt about being conscripted. Most of them, I have to say, said, yeah, it's just one of these things. I felt scared when I got my subpoena papers, but I thought, well, what can you do? You can't avoid it. Frankly, if they had, they wouldn't be there. I think there are probably plenty who have done just that. But anyway, these were people who clearly were prepared to obey the subpoenas. And they said, yeah, they were scared to start off with, but the training had not been bad. And that this was, I think we were meeting them once they were already, I think, a couple of months or certainly a month or so, depending on who they were, into their training, so that they felt a little bit more like they knew what they were doing. But then we did notice that when one chap we spoke to, a young guy about 38, I think he was, we asked him how he felt about it. And we were getting the usual sort of quite bluff response, we'll deal with it. And then we asked him what his wife and kids thought about it. Had they expressed any views? And at that point, really, really out of the blue, his voice started choking with emotion and tears were pricking in his eyes. And he just said, yeah, look, of course she's worried sick. And yeah, no, of course the kids want me to come back as possible. And it just made me think that in all those interviews that I've done on the front lines over time, you often just get the kind of bluff warrior response, but clearly every now and again there is a lot going on in the back of people's minds, and when you ask them in certain situations, you see perhaps something that is a little closer to the truth of just how frightening this is for a lot of people. And this, of course, has been happening since the start of the war itself, but at the beginning of the war, people weren't quite as well aware of the high casualty rates that there are now. And also, I think at the beginning of the war, people were just thrust into it without really having much time to mull things over. Whereas now, guys who get subpoenas, they get told a certain date that they have to report by. They have a lot more time to think about it. And they also have a lot more time to work out how they're going to deal with their families and how that time spent saying goodbye to wives and also children. One guy said to us, I have an 8-year-old son. I asked him, what's the conversation you've had with him? Does he even know that you're going? And he said, yes, he's dimly aware of the war. And we've just, in the last few days that I spent with him, we just tried to spend as much time as possible. I said, did you talk about the war? He said, no, we just played games and tried to have a lot of fun. And then there was a third guy we spoke to who, again, had a son around the age of 8. And he actually said, no, I've not told him as far as he's aware. Daddy is off working in a nearby town and we'll be back fairly soon. So, yeah, it was quite heart-wrenching stuff, really, especially given that there was no bones about it that some of these guys may well end up as casualties in the war, given the very high casualty rates. The other thing was just the general look of these fellas, because of the conscription age, even now is still minimum 25. Most of these guys were still generally, there were a couple in their early 30s, and then a lot, nonetheless, still people in their 40s and even their 50s, not all looking quite in their prime, to put it mildly, and quite a few broken noses here and the odd nose that looked like it was a bit mottled, like there'd been quite a few years on the booze. And just generally, clearly, people who were perhaps not from the upper echelons of society overall, and confirming, I think, that old thing that we've heard perhaps since Vietnam, really, that it tends often to be the working class people, the less privileged in life, who end up getting drafted. Some listeners may remember me talking last week when we were talking about the draft affecting the kind of young, affluent middle class in Kiev and so on, that the Ukrainian government is giving people options as to what kind of units they want to fight in. Do they want to be in a drone unit? Do they want to do artillery or whatever? I did ask these guys whether they'd expressed any kind of preference beforehand as to what sort of units they were in, because the casualty rates, as I say, in frontline infantry assault units are a lot higher than in other units. And none of them said that they had exercised any preference in advance. That might be because they're content to be in an infantry unit, but it might equally be that they're just not the sort of people who are particularly adept at gaming or playing the system and don't tend to read the small print when they get those draft papers in. But yes, it was quite emotional and moving scenes. And it also reminded me of what you sometimes see at Kramatorsk railway station, Kramatorsk being the main town in Donbas, where troops gather for rear echelon activities and R&R, when they get their girlfriends and their wives come in to say hi to them and spend weekends with them on time off. And you often see at that platform a lot of people hugging and crying in a way that I've spent a lot of time at airports and railway stations in my time as a foreign correspondent, but I've never seen people doing it like this, where you see people who've either not seen each other for a long time or who are about to not see each other for a long time and who do not know whether they will again. And the emotion and the tears are all the realer for that. And again, the sense of peril really is quite extreme. But that's my general sense anyway. And we did a piece about that's in Sunday's print edition and was in, I think, Saturday online as well, if any readers or listeners want to go and check it out.
Thanks, Colin. A question from me, please, and then I think Roland's got a couple. So doing a little bit of looking behind the Wizard of Oz curtain into journalism, when you're speaking to these folks and you know that it's getting emotional and you are asking them directly to respond to how does it feel to leave your 8-year-old child behind, and you say that the tears aren't far away from the conversation, how do you judge how far to push that to get a great human interest story and really bring this thing to life for people who have no idea of it, and it draws us all in? But at the same time, you could be making life very, very difficult for some of these individuals if these thoughts stay in the front of their, or are brought to the front of their minds and stick there. So how do you make that judgment?
Well, I'm not going to pretend that I'm some great diplomat. You do ask hard and nasty questions. Being a news reporter is not a job where sensitivity and touchy-feeliness comes into it terribly, a great deal sometimes. I do think in this case it's justified because I want to get it home to readers back in this country and elsewhere that this is a nasty, scary, dangerous war where people who go to war may well not come back again. The casualty rates, I think, I'm reasonably confident in saying are a lot higher than they might be in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I don't want to spare people's finer feelings in that sense. I do want to make them realise just how horrible it is, and that it's draft, it's affecting people that, that could be them in a parallel world. And again, sometimes the way you bring that out is by asking them about how the conversations that they've had with their children or their wives, because that's what makes it relatable to people who've got families back in this country and anybody else, because it's when you rope in the feelings of other people that the stakes come in, because these are not decisions that you're making just on your own. They're decisions that affect other people as well. As regards their ability, whether that kind of question might upset somebody and perhaps make their minds wander in a way that compromise their effectiveness to do their job, and therefore their own safety and the safety of the others around them, I'll just say most of them, as I understand it, are trained very much to keep their eye on the job. And, for example, we went and met a military psychologist who'd been working with this unit, who said, look, a lot of the focus of the job is just focusing in on you and looking after yourself and your buddies, and not dwelling on the fear and the fact that some of your comrades may have died at certain points. She actually said they get quite a lot of people, especially newcomers, who may see somebody being killed or injured, and that can be very difficult. For the newcomers, it's especially hard if they've not actually had any fighting experience themselves already. They've not been through the baptism of fire, and then they suddenly see a colleague badly injured, because they don't really yet feel like they have the confidence in themselves to deal with these situations. They're still not really feeling like they've stood the test. The old timers, it's just maybe seeing the same thing happen time and time again. And she said, we tell them, look, just don't dwell in that world, because if you dwell in the world of your dead comrades, it's a world that you can potentially never get back from. There is a time and a place for thinking about that sort of stuff, but it's not now, and you really have to focus on the job. And generally, just about every soldier I've interviewed while I've been here in the last 2 years, whether they're whether they're Ukrainian soldiers or foreign volunteers, have said the same thing. When you're out there and something bad goes wrong, you focus on the job. You don't think about it too much.
Thanks for that, Colin. I was just going to say, I find in those situations quite often people, they appreciate being treated like adults and having frank conversations sometimes about that kind of thing. When you're having a frank discussion about what's going on in the situation they've got into. That's how I would look at having those interviews.
So with that in mind, chaps, I'll just come back to you for any final thoughts, and then we'll draw stumps for today. So, Roland, any final thoughts to leave us with, please?
Yeah. For about a week before the Russians opened their Kharkiv offensive, we were putting together a piece about what will it look like if Russia puts in a Kharkiv offensive. And then it got held for some reason, and then it happened. Then it had to be rewritten, and then the graphics had to be redone. Anyway, it took ages, and it was out last week. And anyway, it's meant to be a reference point, really. If you go online, you should see this great big piece, which is basically what we think is a kind of general map of the state of the Russian offensive plan for the summer, which I think have you discussed. Is the effort in the Donbas, is the effort in Kharkiv, is one of them a diversion, and so on. I've just been looking at some comments from a Ukrainian defense think tank. I won't try and immediately recall the exact name now, but I can't. But if you look up at the Battle of Vovchansk sits on a river, and if you go a little bit down, you'll find Russians have recently made a push down towards a little crossing point where I believe there's a broken bridge, and the assessment is they're going to try and cross that. If they do, I think the Ukrainian position in Vovchansk might become a lot more difficult. But of course, these are talking about tactical level gains at this stage. Does this grand offensive, testing the Ukrainians up and down the line, turn into a breakthrough, or does it stretch the Ukrainians eventually enough to create a rout or something? I mean, we just don't know. And I think probably the Russians are working on the same kind of assumption that the Ukrainians were working on in their ongoing offensive last summer. It was push and push and push, and maybe we'll get to this point where the Russians just crack because they've put in all their reserves and there isn't anything else, or something like that. So my one thought, a very broad thought really, is if you're watching what's happening in Donbas and Kharkiv over the immediate future, I don't think necessarily this is a question of will they make a breakthrough and make an advance by this time next week. I think it's a question of an ongoing process that we're going to see play out across the summer, I would imagine. That's the depth of my intellect today, Dom.
Well, don't worry, Roland. It's nearly Friday. We're just going in the wrong direction. But Roland, thank you for your time today. Colin's phone has died. He's just managed to email me. Sorry, that's why he disappeared. So, Colin, thank you for your earlier offering. And thanks, everybody, for listening. I'd be interested in your thoughts, actually, about how you receive this stuff. If you feel that journalists and photojournalists, of course, not forgetting, are prying when we ask these kind of questions, or when photojournalists shove a camera into a situation where it might be deemed a bit intrusive. It'd be interesting in your thoughts about, do you feel it brings you closer to the issues and makes you think about stuff, or do you, from on the human side, do you feel it goes too far? But yeah, you know how to get hold of us. ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every email. We really do. I mean, and I love it. People say, dear whoever opens the mail for Ukraine, the latest podcast. It's us, right? It's me, David, and Francis. We're doing knees to chest every day, reading all this stuff and replying to as many as we can. We do. Thank you so much for getting in touch. We can't answer all of them. I do apologise. But it's the three of us here on the other end of that. But ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. And we read every message that you send us. And we thank you all very much for sticking with us. That's it for today. You've got the A-team back tomorrow. I think Santa's little helper is back from Poland. Francis will be here. He's back from his tailors. So everyone in the right place at the right time. I've got to go on a 2-day reporting job to Bordeaux in France. So apologies, I won't be back till Thursday. But you'll have a lot of people who know what they're talking about. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. And thanks, Roland, again. From the Telegraph here in London, we'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. I wish you all a very good afternoon. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from the Telegraph. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to the Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on Twitter Spaces. Follow the Telegraph on Twitter or X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war ramps up, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.